now while we're still in this meditative mode, let's do a contemplative meditation based on what we discussed last week. So, for us human beings, right, we've been contemplating love and compassion. So for us human beings, love and our experience of love and compassion began with our own mother. So we'll just take a few minutes contemplating the kindness of the mother, of our mother, in this life. So you can begin by just thinking about before you were born. So in this contemplation, we imagine, like when I was in my mother's womb as a fetus, before I was born. Actually, it was so difficult for her. Despite her own discomfort, for sure, right, she had to be so careful how she moved, how she slept, what she ate, what she drank. So for month after month, she was so careful protecting me when I was in the womb. And my very first experiences, right, each of us is thinking like that, for sure, right? Our very first experiences of kindness were, actually we were still in the womb, and she, and also our, likely our father, like spoke with sweet tones, right? As we got bigger, getting close to being born. So they would not just take care of how she moved and so on to protect us, but also making sweet sounds and saying sweet things. And science has shown, right, that actually the later stage fetus can actually recognize voices and sounds. And then for sure, without any doubt, right, the mother bore hardships giving birth to me, right? And yet after causing, just through being born, right, so much pain, then immediately, after I was born, right, as soon as she was allowed to, she held me to her. Again, spoke sweet sounds to me, smiled at me, held me. So each of us, we think, right, I was totally, at that time, right, I was tiny, totally helpless, actually I looked kind of, it was even dirty when you're first born and so on. And yet still, she held me close. My parents immediately felt they would protect me, take care of me. And for sure, when I was an infant, I was totally helpless. And so we think about myself, right? Each of us thinks about ourselves. I was actually more helpless than an insect. Even insects can like find their own food and shelter. I was totally incapable of that. If I'd been left alone for just a day, I would have died. So for sure, my first experiences of love and compassion were then. So my parents, like when I was like cold or frightened, and my parents like held me close to them. It made me, you know, you can imagine, right? When you were a baby, for sure, right? That made you feel more safe and more calm and peaceful. For sure, without 100% for sure, right? They fed me every day, especially the mother, right? Often from her own body, or else like, you know, from warming bottles and so on. So much like effort, actually. Right? It was so much work, right? But out of love, out of kindness, she did that. My parents did that. In the middle of the night, right? Night after night, when I woke up crying, they came in, changed diapers, or fed me, or held me close. So actually, whatever positive or negative things I came to think later, the reality is for sure they did that. So many times, like going without rest, without sleep. Every single day, right, for years, like every time I peed, they were dealing with it. Every time I pooped, they were dealing with it. Every time I was hungry, they had to help. And while doing that, then also they spoke to me, which is how I learned language. So the fact that I can understand and speak, for sure, is because they spoke to me back then. They also taught me to walk, encouraging me, you know, holding my hand and so on. And they taught me back then so many countless things, right? Just like how to feed oneself, how to hold a spoon, how to drink from a cup. You know, how to brush one's teeth, wash, go to bed. You know. All these like most basic things, speaking, walking, self-care, all these like really basic tasks that are required for survival. They taught me that. So you think for myself, right? Each of us thinks for ourselves. So why did they go through so much hardship and so much effort? I was small and helpless. I had nothing to offer them. So they only did it out of kindness, out of love, out of compassion for me. So we're doing this kind of contemplative meditation, right, to give rise to a sense of appreciation or feeling of gratitude. for the kindness of others, particularly now for the kindness of our parents. So also, I was just a baby and then a toddler. I had no idea, right? But while they were doing all of that, right, waking up in the middle of the night, caring for me day and night, also they were spending so much of their own resources, right, on me. My clothes didn't come from nowhere. The food I ate didn't come from nowhere. The bed, house. So for sure, right, while bearing hardships and making effort to take care of me, then also they spent their own resources, sacrificing. Oftentimes when parents have children, they're young, they don't have a lot, so they often sacrifice, right, for the sake of their children. And so one is trying to generate a recognition, like a realistic recognition, of how thinking I was a recipient of so much kindness, of so much help, hours and hours, week after week, month after month, year after year, for years actually. And for sure, up until I was at least 5, 6, 7, I was completely helpless, like totally, right? 8 or 9. And then even as a teenager, right? Couldn't take care of myself. So parents had to sacrifice so much. So even now, am I having a body that works, a mind that can understand language, can learn? Right? It's only because of the kindness of others. It didn't arise without any causes. Right? Without the kindness of others, I would have died. So one contemplates in various ways like that until one gives rise to this feeling of appreciation, of gratitude, of being the recipient of love and care, and then one dwells in that feeling. It's like a feeling of inner wealth, of gratefulness, which means also feeling like filled up with what was great, which was love and care and kindness. If it's easy for you to give rise to such feelings, then just give rise to them and dwell on them. Dwell in them. Like let them suffuse your mind. Suffuse your mind. And if it's difficult, right, then just for a moment, like try to put yourself back imaginally to those moments when you were just like a tiny baby, feeling like totally confused and overwhelmed by the world, right? By the sounds, the smells, the taste, the touch. Feeling like totally helpless, confused. And you can think, right, of how, particularly you can think of it like your mother or whoever your primary caretaker was, right? And how they held you close. That just they're picking you up and holding you close to them, immediately you felt better, right? Like if you were crying and frightened or upset, then that was the main thing that could make you feel more safe. It could make you feel better in the whole world. Right? And that parent seemed like everything, right, to you when you were just that little creature. They seemed like so big, so powerful, so warm, so safe. When you were just a tiny baby in their arms, like everything else seemed to fade away. And you could like safely feel safe enough to fall asleep or to relax. Because you felt their sense of protectiveness, of care for you, and of warmth towards you. It's like what allowed you to organize yourself as a creature in the world. We can kind of come into a more interactive mode after contemplating like that. So I was saying last week that I think sometimes these meditations, especially on the kindness of mothers, is not so familiar in our culture. So that we don't spend that much time sort of thinking about that. But actually, and I was saying last time, right, that this is a very basic level of kindness, though. They're not taught. Buddhists, as you notice in the contemplation, right, Buddhists are not talking about some kind of a Buddhist teachings. First, we're just talking about very simple kindness, right? It's a very simple kindness that we received as. And actually, if you think about it, right, for sure it's true. Actually, there's no way around that, right? Like in other words, I quoted last week, right? Like scientists have shown that, though. Actually, right? If there's not a primary attachment figure, if there's not some sense of not just being fed, of course, right? If you're not fed, you die, right? But some sense of somebody who looks at you, who speaks to you. Children don't grow up, actually. Right? They don't develop. Their brains don't develop. So on that very simple level, right? Almost like it includes language, so it's human, right? But it's a mammalian kind of level that we did, because since we're talking about compassion, right? That for sure compassion started then, right? Our experience of compassion, and it's only the Dalai Lama often points it out, right? He says that if you look at human life, and it's just an obvious observation, right? That human life begins with compassion, right? Because in other words, as a fetus, as an infant, and as a toddler, right? Actually being cared for by others, even in our education, right? if you think back when you were a kid, right? If there was a teacher who was kind to you, it made so much difference, right? It made like all the difference in the world, right? Whereas when you were going through elementary school, for example, right? Like if you think back, and then you can think actually, right? I'm sure everybody remembers the people who felt like, oh, this person was kind to me, they liked me, right? And then other teachers you didn't think about much, right? Or you don't remember much, or if you remember them, it's like an aversive feeling. Because just feeling like, whereas otherwise you feel so unsafe actually as a child, right? And if you think it's not just your parents, but grandparents, aunts, uncles, right? If you think back to the people you felt safe around, the people you enjoyed being around, right? And again, if you think about it, what Buddhism is just pointing out is obvious truths, right? Like in other words, actually like you think of your grandparents or aunts or uncles, anybody who loved you and cared for you, right? And actually, like, what was I to say? You had nothing to offer them, right? You were just a kid, right? If anything, you were kind of annoying, right? Right? We cried, then we got old, so then you got to be a teenager, you were more annoying, right? Like, in other words, you really didn't offer them anything, actually, right? And why did they do that, right? Only out of kindness, only out of compassion. So the whole early part of our life, right? Actually, the most important factor for our development was others being kind to us. And, then you look in the middle of your life, right? So, in other words, it's most extreme when you're young, right? Because otherwise you don't live, right? And actually everything depends on that. But then in the middle of your life also, right? Actually, we neglect that, but that's just part of what Buddhism's saying is the role of compassion and kindness in our lives is huge, actually, right? Actually, because first of all, in school, right, in college, and so on, right, and then afterwards, right. If you have any good luck, right, it's that others are kind to you and help you with something, right. How do you get your training? How do you get your actually? How many of if you think, right, your whether it was like creating a resume or actually finding a job or being encouraged while you were looking for work, right? Did you always do everything on your own, or were there ever friends who were helpful to you, ever mentors who were helpful to you? Ever first bosses or second bosses who are helpful to you, right? Actually, if you think back, right, whatever skills you have for your work, right, did they arise causelessly? Did you somehow like pick them out of the space, or did somebody teach you them? Right? So everything we need for our survival actually comes from others. Really, is what this is pointing out. And actually, why did like you think back, right, to early jobs when somebody helped you out, or when you were in school and somebody gave you advice, right? And again, like, for the most part, people do that because they're nice, right? So because they were nice to you. And then at home also, right? Like, have there been people who have been there for you when you were having hard times? And oftentimes we think, what Buddhism's suggesting, Buddhist psychology, is that sometimes we have a tendency to think too much, actually, to focus too much on negative events, right? And what it's saying is, you'll be psychologically healthier and more kind and compassionate yourself if you focus realistically on how kind others have been to you. That's much more useful, actually, for you. It's also true, though. Of course, everybody's had experiences of somebody being unkind, but actually there are much, much fewer, than the experiences of others being helpful or kind to you. Right? Like how many times when you walk in a store or a restaurant, like somebody smiles, and it's just, just like a very ordinary, everyday things, right? The person's just like, oh, where would you like to sit? Or, oh, here, do you know about this? Or do you know about that, right? Whereas the experience of somebody being rude or mean is rare, actually. So most of our lives are qualified by or, filled with small kindnesses and sometimes big kindnesses. Then if you get sick, right, actually the kindness of others is completely, totally required or you die, right? Whereas if you're sick and you don't, like doctors, nurses, right, and then also like family members who help out and things like somebody give you a ride, or, right, like it's totally necessary, right? And right, if you've ever been in the hospital or you've ever been just to a doctor's office, right, if you're really feeling sick, right, and just a little bit of kindness, right, of a nurse or a worker, like just being nice to you, right, and trying to help you out, and you call back and you're maybe upset that whatever the pharmacy didn't get the call or something or whatever, right, and just like people being nice means so much, right, and again, the vast majority of the time, people are nice to you. And then if you look forward, right, to when you're elderly, again, like when you're nearing the end of your life, right? You'll, as you just like in childhood, you'll be more in need of the kindness of others, right? There's no doubt. Right? In other words, that you'll need people to help you, right? You can't, there will come a time, right? If you're lucky and you don't die soon, right? Then there will come a time where you'll need people to help you, right? With just tasks, right? Like there is as you get older and older, right? Then there come times where you can't do things, right? So a neighbor, another person, just helping with small tasks, it becomes so important. Right? And then eventually, right at the end of your life, right, when you're nearing death, right, then again you need kindness from others, right? So much, actually, right? Again, you're so dependent on the kindness of others, right? Again, it means like so much when you're on your deathbed or you're in hospice, right? It means the whole world, right? That somebody not be disregarding you, or if you're in pain, they come and give you medicine, or they try to help, right? Just like when you were a baby, it again becomes like the most important thing, that others treat you kindly. So the point here is just that from the time actually from before we're born until the end of our lives, compassion and kindness are, first of all, there as part of our lives, and that we're the recipient of so much kindness is the idea here, right? And then for generating bodhicitta, one contemplates over and over again, actually, when in order to generate great compassion, one spends just a lot of time thinking of others as kind. So there's many quotes like where Lama Zopa will say things like, others are like wish-fulfilling jewels or something, right? Actually, the eight verses of mind training say that. So what it means, or others are wish-fulfilling, right? It means to see others as precious. Right? That's the idea, right? And so in our daily lives, we don't often see others as precious, right? We just like look at somebody and think whatever, but in Mahayana Buddhism, that's the idea, is that you train your mind. In other words, like whatever you see others as you whatever your habit is, that's how you'll see others. Does that make sense? Like, whereas that's just your habitual, what's the word? Whatever you habituate your mind to. I was going over this a little bit last time, right? Like, so like for example, like if actually like, in other words, we can familiarize our mind with anything, right? Like somebody we never saw before, if on the news, they put the news every day, if they put up on the news, this person's a terrorist or they're evil, right? Or they killed, they were a mass murderer, right? After a short time, well, just seeing their face, you think, oh, they're terrible, right? You feel like horrified by them. Right? So that's just habituation, right? In other words, our minds get habituated to anything. On the other hand, like, if somebody says, oh, this person saved your life, right? Then they keep saying, oh, wow, like you feel so appreciative, you see that. So in other words, your mind gets habituated. So in Mahayana Buddhism, what you're doing is you're habituating your mind to a useful and true aspect, right? Which is just emphasizing, you can focus on anything, right? So it's saying focus on the kindness that others show you. And what happens then, right, is that you go around then feeling a sense of appreciation, of warmth, of affection, of appreciation, of gratitude to others, right? Which, first of all, is just a good way to walk around every day, right? It's a lot better than walking around paranoid or upset with others. And it creates a foundation for a life grounded in love and compassion, and it's also the foundation for developing universal compassion and altruism and bodhicitta. Yeah.
You said in the face of a mass murderer, you see him, it's television and you feel. Like I had that experience when I saw the photo of the Boston killer, and I couldn't focus on his kindness. I couldn't find a way to do that. Do you have any suggestions as to? I mean, this person committed maybe not harm to you, but harm to the human race. And if you think about the ripple effect of all the damage that it created, people lose trust in each other. I mean, it becomes an unsafe world. I mean, how does one find an appreciation, a gratitude for that person in one's heart and in one's mind?
I'll say I'll just say briefly at least, if you look at it from from the perspective, I'll just answer from the perspective of Mahayana Buddhism, really, right? Like I'm not going to do. I could do a more I was hesitant. I could do a more Western response, but I'm not going to do a truly Buddhist response. So a genuine Buddhist response, right, would be like this. Would be to so a bodhisattva, right, would look at that person. So a bodhisattva is somebody who's generated great compassion and bodhicitta. And so what a bodhisattva would look at, right, when they look, is they look and they see, right, like this, so that person, right, I've been related with countless times since beginningless existence. Like in other words, there's no beginning to existence, so it's infinite interconnectedness, right? So that person has been, like in past lives, was my mother, my father, my best friend, right? Was unbearably kind to me, right? And then also, like in my future lives, right, my achievement of like patience, of love, of compassion, of generosity depends on others, including that person. And actually, a Buddha, you can't become a Buddha if you don't have compassion for all beings. So that person, my Buddhahood depends on that person, actually. So everything, all my happiness, all my well-being in the past and the future is interdependent with that person. And so in this life, like that person was completely crazy, actually, right? Like in other words, crazed by anger or by hate. And the idea would be, you actually come to a place, right? If you're actually contemplating from Mahayana point of view, like the analogy I'll give is this, is like, so if you were going through the kindness of your own mother, let's say, I'm using that example because we just meditated, right? And then if like, there's actually a contemplation like this that the Panchen Lama in Easy Path describes, where he says, if you contemplate over and over again the kindness received from your mother when you were an infant, right? He says, and then, like, think of your mother near the end of her life having something like Alzheimer's, let's say, right? And being crazy and acting out, right? And then, you know, even like sometimes it happens, right? You can hit some, you know, strike out or, you know, say harsh things or something like that, right? That if you've just contemplated her kindness when you were young, right? Then the feeling that arises is one of compassion and actually sadness, right? Like in other words, that this person who was so kind early on, who did so much for me, is now under the control of a disease, right? Like in this case, I'm just giving an example, like Alzheimer's, right? Where you would so wish that you could protect her, right? But you can't really much, right? In other words, you can't, nobody can stop Alzheimer's. I'm just giving that example, right? And so the feeling that comes is almost a kind of unbearable compassion and affection and sort of sadness at the same time. And so the idea would be, right, that if you think of like somebody who's doing bad things as having been kind to you in past lives, and in this life, from a Buddhist perspective, you'd say like creating the cause is totally miserable, insane with hatred, right? And then creating the causes for horrific future rebirths, right? That eventually the feeling would arise like that, right? Like, in other words, like you so wish you could protect the person, right? Because they're creating causes mostly for their own suffering. I mean, of course they've caused a lot of suffering to others, but in this life and in future lives, the idea, and actually it's true already, right, in this life. In other words, they were already miserable. They're headed towards more misery and more misery and more misery. And so actually there's like a feeling that arises of, it's more compassion than anything else, actually, right? Like a kind of sense of sorrow and compassion for the person. So that's actually the Mahayana.
See, you said, what would a bodhisattva do? But I'm not a bodhisattva, so, you know, I didn't feel the compassion that you're describing, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
And I just want to tell you one other situation. When I was in Dharamsala last year, they've got all the photos of these monks that are self-immolating, because, and they show every week the photos of the ones that are self-immolating because of the Chinese occupation of Tibet. And I just couldn't get my brain around that. Like, these are like, you know, if you think about the cultural genocide, but the human genocide, you know, these are very innocent people. These are people that are practicing Buddhism. These are you know, they're keeping out of, they're not disturbing anybody. And yet, now as a result of all of this, these monks are taking their own lives. And so, I mean, it's sad, for sure. I mean, one can feel it, but one can also feel, I mean, a sense of outrage about that. I mean, it just seems so unfair, and it just seems so wrong, because they didn't do anything, or did they? I mean, you know, to deserve this.
Well, actually, I'll answer it in a deeper way by going to the next point, actually, in our contemplation. I think it'll actually address it, the next point in the contemplations. It answers it on a deeper level, or on a more of a training level. How do you train your mind to deal with that? So actually, maybe see if this answers your question, the next point. Because Because what I wanted to talk about anyway, which I think directly relates to that, is this. So what we've been really doing in this module is, there are two main methods to generate bodhicitta. I mentioned this in the first class, right? There's one method is called the 7-point cause and effect method, which means viewing all beings as mothers and recollecting the kindness and so on. And then there's equalizing and exchanging self to others. But Lama Tsongkhapa combined those two methods into one. So we're covering in that way, so that we cover all the main points, but in an integrated way that's both very effective and also accessible to beginners while including the benefits of more advanced approaches. So we use that one, right? That way we'll cover all the things. So, and this is the next point anyway, which I think addresses that. So the early points, the points we covered first is just general equanimity, right? So even-mindedness. Then we covered recognizing beings as mothers, recollecting the kindness of others, and wishing to repay that kindness. But now comes, the next point anyway, is this point of unique equalizing of self with other. And so which is a kind of unique form of equanimity. The earlier equanimity was just sort of, was just trying to sort of calm down our sense of hatred towards people we don't like and huge attachment to people we do like, right? So it was kind of just trying to calm down our extreme projections. This kind of equanimity is a bit different, so I think I want to cover that now and see if that answers your question as well, but I think also it's a useful contemplation. And so this, now we're starting into the second method, right? This is where we integrate in these techniques from equalizing and exchanging self for others. And so what does it mean to equalize self with other? So I want to start with what is not, so to just understand what we're talking about, it's useful to start by describing us, which are not equalized self with others, okay? In other words, ordinary people. Right? And so ordinarily, right, if we look at ourselves, it requires a little bit of introspection and honesty with oneself, right? But ordinarily, my attitude, right, first of all, I don't treat others equally, and I certainly don't treat others equally to how I treat myself, right? So for example, like, if I have a splinter, right, which is more important, me having a splinter or somebody I've never met having cancer? Ordinarily, to be honest, right, what do I think more time about? Somebody tells me, oh, my cousin's mom got cancer, I say, oh, that's terrible. And then 3 minutes later, if they walk away, I'm like, okay, now where am I going next? Right, it's not like, whereas if I get a small splinter, I'm like, oh my goodness, what am I going to do? It's going to hurt to take it out. Do I have good tweezers at home? How will I disinfect them? Is there a good, so it's just like mental preoccupation, right? What we focus our mental energy on is mostly our own, right? So the same thing like economic, right? If I lose a few dollars, it's like a big deal, right? Somebody else loses a lot of money, it's not that big a deal, right? If somebody treats me badly, I can be very upset. If somebody treats somebody else badly, I might like laugh at, right? Oh, that was funny, right? You see somebody like say something, oh, that was entertaining, right? Then somebody says to me, oh my goodness, how could that happen? I've got to like, whatever, the police should be involved or something. Right, we hear, like, if you hear about something that happened in a place you've never been in the world, right? If you haven't been there, then you don't feel you say, oh, wow, that's strange, right? Whereas if it's like your hometown or your home place, right, then it's like a big deal. Right? Somebody says, oh, there was a hurricane and lots of things were destroyed. If it's where you live, then it's important, right? If it's someplace you've never been, that you've never visited, then you kind of like turn the channel, right? Or you say, oh, like, why aren't they playing my music? So you hit the button on your whatever, TV or your radio. So our ordinary attitude is like extremely self-preoccupied. That makes sense? Like that's our ordinary samsaric attitude, is like self-preoccupation. And then also so then this whole issue of friends, enemies, and strangers is totally also like in relation to me, right? In other words, so if first of all it's a self-preoccupation, and then there comes this thing of like, well, I do care what happens to so-and-so because that's my friend, right? Or my child, or my parent, or my whatever it would be, right? And then others, right, like who we don't like, actually then we may be happy if something bad happens to them, right? If somebody we really don't like, right, then you actually can be happy that something bad happens to them. And then most people we don't care about at all, right? And so whatever happens to them, we don't really care. Right? So there's like a total bias, first of all, mainly It's in relation to me, and then in relation to mine, right? And it like goes out in circles almost. Like how important somebody is in my worldview is like totally determined by how much they do for me, actually, right? So that's the ordinary self-centered. And so one has to first, if one is going to do this contemplation, introspect and say, wow, that really is, like, there is, if I look at how I'm relating to others, oftentimes that's what happens. You know what I mean? Like, there is if you see exceptions to that, good. There is that means you've made some meaningful progress in love and compassion. But we're trying to look at the aspect of ourselves where we're like that, right? In order to work with it, right? Because the idea in Buddhism is like you're training your mind from mostly from more self-centered to more compassionate, right? So you have to recognize your self-centered aspects, your selfishness or your like that. And then the idea is to train in this case, it's equalizing of self with others. Which, but the idea here also is that that self-centeredness, the underlying premise, is also that, like the Dalai Lama often says, right, that we use much of Buddhist meditation is using reason, right? And the idea here is that self-centeredness is unreasonable. Right? It's unreasonable. Well, we'll get into lots of reasons as we go along, but part of the reason it's unreasonable, one is that you're not the most important person in the world, right? Everybody's equally important. That's the idea of that, you know, and actually our Declaration of Independence says that, but we don't ordinarily feel that way, right? And so the idea is you're training your mind to feel and to view the world in a way that's grounded in a realistic sense of things, right? So one is that everybody's important. Everybody is equally important, and that the world would be a better place if, not if everyone, but if you, right, approach the world that way. See, if I say, oh, the world would be a better place if everybody does that, actually that's a meaningless statement because that's saying, well, yes, or if everybody else would treat me nicely, right? That's not useful. What's useful is to say, if I acted that way, the world would be a better place, right? In other words, if I approached others from the perspective of their happiness being equally important to my happiness, the world will be better. And I'll be a better person, and also I'll be making the world a better place. Does that make sense? Like, so that's the idea, is that we're trying to use reasoning to change, and habitual, because meditation really means, I said this earlier, I mean in other classes, but the Tibetan and actually the Sanskrit words for meditation really mean habituation, right? So you're trying to habituate your mind to a realistic, reasonable, and healthy way of viewing self and other. So the first thing is you admit to yourself the reality of how you ordinarily relate to others, right? And then, what I want to do is, I'm going to go through a number of different like contemplations, and Khenchen Rinpoche taught this. There's like the Dalai Lama's junior tutor, Trijang Rinpoche, created like nine different contemplations for equalizing self with others. But then I'm going to elaborate on them a little bit also from what Lama Zopa Rinpoche has taught. But so the first of the 9 realistic training, mental trainings for viewing yourself and others as equal is one we talked about a little bit before, but it's that everybody's equal in wanting happiness and not wanting suffering. Right? So this is the first one. And so that's clearly true, right? In other words, if you contemplate a little bit, you start to look and you say, yes, even like somebody I never met, they want to be happy just like I do. Even animals, they want to be happy just like I do. Even people I don't like, for sure they want to be happy just like I do. They're trying to be happy, right? And their method of finding happiness and mine might be different right now, but that doesn't, like, in other words, mine's been different other times also. We all try different things to be happy, but for sure they're trying to be happy and trying not to suffer, right? And so everybody is totally equal in that way. Right? In this contemplation, I want to elaborate a little bit from things Lama Zopa Rinpoche has pointed out, which I think are very helpful. So it's this, if you're contemplating like that, right, everybody's equal, right? So like every person in this room is equal to every other person in this room in wanting to be happy and not wanting to suffer. Everybody in Washington, D.C. is equal, and the Washington area is equal, right, in wanting to be happy and not wanting to suffer. So like whatever their race, gender, culture, like whatever religion, right, all those things, doesn't matter. Everybody's equal, exactly the same in wanting to be happy and not wanting to suffer. Right? whether they've been kind to me or unkind to me, it doesn't matter. They're exactly equal in wanting to be happy and not wanting to suffer. Right? So if you elaborate just on this first point, right, then you start to recognize, okay, so then actually, like if everybody's the same in wanting to be happy and not wanting to suffer, right? First is like my being preoccupied only with my own well-being is silly, right? In other words, because we're all the same. It also doesn't work, right? Like in other words, if you're contemplating like this, you can also elaborate a little bit. You can say, well, actually, if I go around trying to make myself happy, disregarding the happiness of others, and they then relate to me trying to make themselves happy and disregarding mine, right? There's going to be conflicts. And actually, it's not a very effective way for me to be happy, right? Because if I think I'm going to be happy in the absence of others' happiness, not recognizing our interdependence, it doesn't work, actually, right? Whereas that's the problem, actually. If you look at this idea of not recognizing that others are equal, right? Then if I'm in a relationship, right? Well, I'm wanting my happiness and not equally seeing the other's need for happiness, I'm going to have a problem in my relationship. If I approach my family in that way, there are going to be problems in my family. If I approach any group I'm part of in that way, there are going to be problems in the group, right? Because I'm going to have tension, because I'm wanting this, you're wanting that, right? And like, I think this will make me happy, and then if you think that will make you happy, then there's going to be a problem, right? And so as long as I approach others thinking only of my own happiness, I'm never going to find my happiness, right? And not only that, but others are numberless, right? And I'm just one. So there's a fundamental problem in this idea of not, in other words, if all others are equal in wanting happiness, and then but then I'm preoccupied with my own happiness, actually deep down, subconsciously, let's say, right, I'm aware that I'm trying to do something like, I'm wishing that the universe and all others would allow me to be happy, right? But actually, like if I'm putting myself at odds with the universe and with all others, then I'm this tiny thing, it's never going to work, right? Or it's a totally unrealistic, unhealthy approach. And the idea here, right, this very first training would be that you actually contemplate, so if others are numberless, and if everybody wants to be happy, then what's a reasonable way to live, right? A reasonable way to live is to live my life in a way that will maximize everybody's happiness. That the purpose of my life is to make all beings as happy as I can, right? Now, I'm not in control of everybody's happiness, but in other words, that if I live my life thinking that the purpose of it is to bring, not leaving myself out, but saying, I'm just one. Like, the purpose of my life is to make number of beings happy, right? Automatically, you're in accordance with the wishes of all beings, right? Versus being at odds with the wishes of all others, right? And so if you're always thinking, I want to be happy, right? There's always this, my point there is this, is if you look at it psychologically, there's always a feeling of insecurity, right? Like in other words, if I'm mainly focused on my happiness, right? Well, then I have something. But then there's this feeling of, well, somebody may take it. How am I going to protect mine, right? And then then this person, I want them. Then somebody might then they're going to steal my friend. Oh, how am I going to stop that? There's always going to be this insecurity. Whereas if you can train your mind, right, to sort of just recognize reality. That's all it is here, right? Like this point is just to recognize reality, that everybody is equal in wanting happiness and not wanting suffering. Right? And you're training your mind to actually, so already you start to feel a sense of like relaxing that self-centeredness and sort of saying, okay, so my purpose is to be interrelated with others in helpful ways. So that's just the first training, right? In equanimity, this unique equanimity. Then the next training, which is related, but just a slight variation on that, is also that everyone, right, is deprived of the happiness they want, right? In other words, if you walk around this, if you travel the whole planet, right, looking for somebody who has everything, who's totally satisfied. Right? Actually, if you get to, I've noticed this. You have to actually, the more you get to know somebody, right? Actually, when you first meet somebody, you say, "Hey, how you doing?" They say, "Oh, great." Right? Whereas that's polite, right? And then if you get to know somebody, right, do they continue to say, "Great"? Nobody, right? There's no, like, think about it in your life, right? I mean, there are people who may have good things happen. That's true, right? But in other words, right. So if you get to know people, right, right, if they don't have some kind of physical problem, somebody they care about does. If they don't have that, then they have a financial problem. If they don't have that, then they have an emotional problem, right? And it's easy if you don't know people, right? Or this is also like realistic, right? When you don't know people and you're, what's the word, immature, right? Then you can think, oh, well, really, depending on what you value, right? So you can say, oh, really rich people are very happy, or very beautiful people are really happy, or somebody with a lot of popularity is very happy, right? But as you get more mature and you get to know people and you talk to people, right? And especially if you talk intimately, right? Then actually, like, everybody's story is filled with so much sorrow and problems. Right? There's a famous story that relates to that it really struck me at the time, so I'll share it. Like, the story of the Buddha, actually, that there was a woman whose child died, right? And she showed up to the Buddha with the corpse of her child in her arms, right? Like weeping uncontrollably, right? And she said to the Buddha, "I've heard that you're the wisest person, or something in the world. Bring my child back to life." Like, and actually, it's very. I guess it struck me as very poignant because I think it's very realistic. In other words, I think that's what somebody would do. She said, "Bring my child back to life," and he said, "If you can." Now remember, India. I just point this out. India is a place that's not like Northern Virginia, right? It's not with new construction. Whereas India is a place that's had villages that have been there for thousands of years, right? So the Buddha said, if you can bring me a cup of rice from a house that hasn't known similar sorrow, I'll bring your child back to life. And so she went door to door carrying the corpse of her child and a cup and said, I'm looking for a house that's had no sorrow. Have you, is this that house, right? And of course, every house she went to, people said, oh my goodness, my son just died in a war, or my father is ill, or my this, or it went on and on, right? The stories of sorrow. And she went from village to village, house to house for a long period of time, asking everybody, and everyone she met had similar stories of sorrow to her own. And so finally, she realized what the Buddha was pointing out to her, and she, I guess, cremated her child and came back to the Buddha and said, I couldn't find that cup of rice, but how do I achieve liberation? And then she became a great saint in that life, because she understood deeply the nature of suffering that we all share, right? And so that's this point, right? The point that she learned through her experience of going door to door is in a way the point that this contemplation is teaching, which is that everybody is deprived, right? Everybody, they say, the analogy that's given sometimes, so this one is like, everyone is like a beggar, right? And like, if three beggars show up starving, is there some reason to say, well, I'll feed this one and leave those two out, right? In other words, we're all like that. And so it's this recognition that just as I don't have every happiness I want, and I'm subject to so many other kinds of suffering, right? Everybody, and like, so actually the worst people in the world are totally deprived of happiness, right? The best, the people, and like, so if somebody's like actually, if you look at it this way, it's totally true, actually, right? Like, so the most wealthy people in the world are deprived of happiness, right? The most famous people in the world are deprived of happiness. The most powerful people in the world are deprived of happiness. It's totally clear, right? And actually, if you get to know them, sometimes it's worse, right? Like, and there are sometimes the people you idealize and think they have the most happiness actually have less. That's often true. So the idea here, right, is that I am no different. My friends are no different. My strangers, enemies, doesn't matter, right? We're all the same in that way. And that's true, isn't it? Yeah, so anyway, that's clear, right? And then the next one is a metaphor, right? That also we're all sick. And what this means is that we're all sick. In Buddhism, in Buddhist psychology, sickness means having mental afflictions, right? Having jealousy, pride, anger, craving, ignorance, right? So this training, you contemplate that actually we're all the same in that way, right? So actually, like, this one's quite disturbing if you think about it, right? But see, ordinarily, because we cherish ourselves, this starts to answer your question from earlier about murderers and so on. I mean, all of them do, actually. I mean, those other ones apply as well, but this one particularly does, I think. Because in this one, when you think we're all sick with the afflictive emotions and ignorance, right? the idea of this one in part is that part of my own self-centeredness or self-cherishing is that I think I'm quite wonderful, right? Whereas everybody actually and actually everybody thinks they're special in a way. Even people who think they're bad, right? Like have low self-esteem, then they think if you actually, right, people get caught, well, I'm the worst. But, well, that's still quite special, isn't it? Like, in other words, we have this habit of thinking we're quite something unusual, right? Like I'm really special in some way. Even if I'm the worst at something, I'm still quite special and important, but usually I think I'm okay. And the idea here is this recognition that we're all the same. We're all crazy, actually, in a way. What Buddhism's saying is, actually what Buddhism really says, sometimes I think this, Buddhism has this idea of a noble being, an Arya, right? That means somebody who's seen reality directly in meditation. Actually, the Buddhism says anybody who hasn't seen reality directly is in some sense crazy, right? In other words, we haven't seen the nature of how we even exist, right? So we don't know what we're doing, right? We don't know, actually we never see things realistically. And so, like from a Buddhist perspective, actually, like if I think, oh, well, I'm quite good, but those people are quite bad, right? It could be anybody, right? It could be a particular person or it could be a group. What Buddhism is saying, actually Lama Zopa often says things like this. He's saying like, please try to cultivate equanimity, because otherwise, from the perspective of many lifetimes, it's that otherwise you're going to be a mass murderer, actually, right? You're going to be like, whereas the person who does like these huge, horrible actions and harms thousands of people will be you, right? Like, and so Lama Zopa is often saying, please take a vow, for all future lives, I'll never harm others, because he's trying to stop us from becoming like that, in a sense. Because the view in Buddhism is if you have many lifetimes, right, is that, unless we achieve the levels of the path and sort of progress along the path, right, to these higher realizations, actually we're all the same, right? We're all insane, and we often think, well, because in this life, whatever, I happen to have achieved some kind of education and have some kind of something, like, oh, well, I'm always like this, right? We have this idea that this is me and that I'll always be in this situation. And what Buddhism is saying is, no, actually, look in your own mind. If you still have hate, right, then you're the same. Then, in other words, if you can still give rise to hatred, then you're the same as you're not. You haven't yet become truly different from any other terrorist or something, right? Like in other words, only somebody who's actually liberated from hatred, right? But they've already achieved equanimity, so they don't. It's not going to be a problem. The point there is that, right, is like, so this recognition of equanimity and of even-mindedness is also sort of giving up our sense of our own specialness and of our own, so like, if you cultivate this, right, that if you ever think I'm the best, like, I'm so wonderful, right, it's like, actually I'm the same as the worst people. If you ever think I'm the worst at something, well, actually, in one way that's true, but in another way we're all the same. Like in other words, I can't be the worst because everybody's deluded, right? Everybody has their own afflicted states of mind, and so in that way we're all in the same boat. We're all the same, which leads to a sense of in one way it's like this one cuts through a lot of narcissistic self-image stuff, right? But it also comes to a point of like really feeling equal with others, right? Of feeling. And so that, like whether somebody's a president or a murderer, which sometimes can be the same thing, sometimes not, but like it's the same difference. Like in other words, like we're all confused, right? We all don't know what we're doing most of the time, and we're all caught up in jealousy and pride and anger and fear and so on. It doesn't matter. We're all similar in that way. Let's keep going through. I want to cover all 9 points. So the next one is kind of something we already talked about some, which is that others have been kind to me in in the past, present, and future. Right? So this would encompass that others have been my mother in past lives, but it would also encompass others' kindness in this life to me. All those things we talked about last week about, my food comes from others, right? Everything I eat comes from the kindness of others. The places every place I go, right, somebody else built it. Cars I go in, roads I go on, clothes I wear, anything I use comes from the kindness of others. Which is true, actually, right? Like, in other words, none of these things arise causelessly. And this one also includes that all my future happiness totally depends on others. Actually, because all good karma comes from kindness, right? From compassion, and from nonviolence, right? Which means it's all created in relationship to others. Right? Actually, the past, present, and future, all good things come from positive relations with others. That's huge. I mean, these are all huge contemplations, right? The next one is actually in case a qualm arises. Sometimes people will feel, yeah, but sometimes others aren't so nice to me. Right? And this contemplation is one where you actually contemplate how it's not denying that others can be unkind, but it's saying that the kindness of others hugely outweighs their harm. So that's that one. And then the sixth point is a really important one, which is that we're all the same in being mortal and impermanent. Which is true, right? That we're all going to die is definitely true. Actually, if we realize that alone, right, then so many things we wouldn't do, actually. Right? That's true, actually, right? If we recognize that others could die today. Actually, we always view things as permanent, actually. This is one of the delusions that Buddhism points out. We view things as more permanent than they are, right? And so it rarely occurs to us that the other person we're in a conflict with could die today. Right? I mean, it might occur to us in the sense that we wish they would, but that's not helpful, right? If you're really mad. But that's not what we're talking about. What we're saying is the realistic recognition they may die, right? And then it's like, well, who cares? In other words, actually, if you're in the middle of a petty fight with somebody and they suddenly drop dead, right? How do you feel? Right? You feel either regret or you feel really stupid, right, for having just argued with them. Right? You say, "Oh, I can't believe I just fought with them over that." Right? So we don't recognize that that's true all the time, actually, that they could die, and that therefore our conflicts, like the things that we that we get caught up in, from the point of view of mortality, are so silly, right? Or so petty, oftentimes. So that's that one. And I'll just cover the last three, so then you guys can ask questions. We can have some discussion about it. Next one is that there are no inherent friends, enemies, or strangers, right? So this one is the contemplation that that it's based on others' behavior to us. That if others are nice to us, then we say they're my friend, and if others suddenly treat me meanly, then I think they're my enemy, right? And the idea here is that we talked about this a little bit before, that we tend to actually, it's really true if you look at your own experience. I just want to point this out, psychologically for each of us, right? Is that when you like somebody, right, and then you see them, this feeling arises wow, there they are, that's them, that's my friend, right? Like you could point out your friend there, right? And then when you don't like somebody, and you see them, right, it feels like there's my enemy, right? Even to a point, people do that. That's, there he is, there she is, and it feels so much like it's out there, right? And what this point is saying is that's a complete projection of your own mind, actually. In other words, there's no reality out there that makes them friend, enemy, or stranger from their own side, right? It's just, and these 3 points all get at that in a different way. One is, so the first one is, it's just based on some little behavior they did. And actually, if you check, I've pointed this out before, I think to me this one is always funny in a way. I mean, funny in a sad sort of ironic way, but that actually people, right, like we say, that's them, to the point where you'd want to kill the person, right? In other words, that happens in the world, right? Like nations kill each other because they say this is my enemy, right? But then, if you just look 15, 20 years later, then that's my friend. I'll kill somebody else if they try to harm them, right? It happens all the time in the world, right? I often joke that if you see two people on their wedding day and then you see them in divorce court, right? On the wedding day, I can't live without this person. They're the most cherished. And then if you look at the same two people in divorce court, it's just the sight of them, I can't, just having to see them is so painful. I don't want to see, even the thought of having to maybe see them is so horrible. In a bad legal case, right? But, the same thing, right? If you look at, just in our own, there are countless examples of this, right? Where, take the example of, what's the word? People who, when the Russians were fighting in Afghanistan, right, there were people who were called, heroic rebel fighters, right? Because they were fighting against communism. Right? Then now those same people are labeled Taliban terrorists, right? You've been there, like, but it's the same, it was the same people though, right? It's just a different label, because then they were fighting against United States. I'm just pointing from the perspective of the United States, right? Oh, they're fighting against my enemy, they're my friend, right? Now now they're labeled this, now they're my enemy. And then if things change again, they could be called a friend, right? Like, so it's based on behavior, but the same thing, right? Like, I often think, you just have, like, you just have to think of the example of, from the perspective of the United States, right? There have been times where Britain was the most hated enemy, right? Like, as they were like considered evil. If you look at like the tracts from that time, right? Like, it was like the way people now talk about, somebody, terror, somebody we label a terrorist. Right? That time, like, England was like horrible, right? And then there were times where France was like, the most hated enemy, and and then it just everything changes. Is the point? But that happens in ordinary people's lives too, right? So like somebody comes along and you don't, like, actually you've had this experience though yourself, right? So somebody comes along and you look at them and you think nothing, right? Like they walk by you and you never met them before, right? They're like, you come across them and you have no thought at all. Like they seem like they're almost as interesting as a piece of wood or something, right? Like then they're nice to you. Like maybe you play some sports together, or you go out to eat together, you do some things together, right? Then after a while, like you think, oh wow, this is like one of my best friends. They're wonderful, right? Like what a great person. Then some other time, right, down the road, like they don't return your phone calls, or they say a couple rude comments, right? Like they say a few things that you don't like, or they get into an argument with somebody you do like, or something, right? And then you think, they're kind of annoying. And each time it seems like it's them, right? Like each of those phases, right? When they walk by and they were nothing, when you thought, oh, they're one of my good friends, then when you thought they're like annoying, right? All of those, it seemed like it was them, right? It was actually your mind labeling because of like some temporary circumstance, right? And so that's actually the next point is that that you just impute, right? So all of those kind of categories, right, are just imputed, and that leads to the third point that. It's like this, actually. If I'm here, right, at this, in Fairfax, right, and I'm thinking to go to Baltimore, then I'm here and Baltimore's there, right? Later, if I'm in Baltimore, then Baltimore's here and Fairfax is there, right? If I'm on this coast, right, if I'm in Washington area, then California's over there, right, out west, right? But then if I go to California, then Washington's here. I mean, Washington's there and California's here, right? Even west, right? If I go to London, right? If I fly around the globe in London, well then Washington's west, right? If I go all around the globe. So the point is that all those labels are relative, right, to one's own position. And so one way of looking at that is to say, so friend and enemy are always relative to one's position and relationally to others. There's nothing about the other that makes them inherently that, right? And this is another one that gets at your point earlier. Like if you saw the interview, right? If you I remember with that particular murder, right? When you saw the interviews with that person's parents, right? Like there was I remember seeing an interview with them, and that, like the parents were so upset and weeping and like, horrified, right? And like still feeling protective of their child, right? And the point is like that's always true, right? In other words, it's always we never. In other words, if you contemplate, in other words, if you don't contemplate this way, right, then wherever position you're in, you'll view others from that, like solely from that perspective, right? So like, so if I'm in this country, then I'll view things from this country. Then if I move, if I'm from another country and culture, then I'll view things from that. If I'm in one family, then I view it from my family's perspective. If I'm in another family, then I view it from that. But if you contemplate like this, right? You don't deny your own perspective, right? In other words, yes, I'm still, whatever, human or something, or I'm still a person, I'm still walking. In other words, if I'm here, I don't think I'm in California, that's not the point. But the point is that you don't any longer take your projections as literally true, right? So a projection arises about somebody, right? And you recognize, oh, it's just a projection actually, right? In other words, it's just like, because of some causes and conditions, I'm sort of projecting this label. But you see beneath the label, right, actually two uh, to something more fundamental, right? Which is just another sentient being who, as we talked about earlier, who wants to be happy, doesn't want to suffer, is deprived of happiness, right? And is sick and confused, just like I am, with mental delusions. And so the idea here, right, is just that. And actually, I want to add one more thought to this one, right? This perspective of like that these things like friend and enemy and so on are just labeled, right? But also self and other are just labeled, right? In other words, I'm me and you're you because I, you know, whatever, because I have eyeballs and ears, and so I'm saying, oh, I'm here, right? And then Fidel's there, right? So I say, this is me, that's him, right? But actually, that even that, it's not, again, it's not denying that there's a difference, right? Like, but it's the difference is conceptual. There's not a fundamental, there's not an inherent difference, right? The difference is just one of labeling, essentially, right? And labeling and conditioned, like, and conditionality, right? But there's no inherent difference, actually, right? In other words, and so if I, you know, so like for example, if I put myself empathically in the other person's perspective, then like, you know, then if I imagine myself inside Fidel's perspective, well then I'm over there, right? Or he's over there, you know, then Lauren's over there, right? It's still labeled, right? And so for example, through empathy, we can put ourselves in somebody else's position, right? So do you see that point there? And if you get to that, then you've equalized self with others, right? And again, you get the feeling there. It's no longer, in other words, it's not that you think, it's not that you're, it's realistic. It's not, you're not, it's not that I would walk around saying, oh, my name's Fidel, and let me, you know, and I'm going to go to the bank and ask them for a withdrawal or something, right? That would be delusional, right? The point is recognizing, you know, yes, I have one ID and Fidel has a different ID, right? Your name is different on your ID than my name on my ID. But that those differences are just, actually, the difference is whatever. So my parents made up a name, his parents made up a name, right? There's nothing inherent to me that makes me Lorne. My mom just made up a name, right? She picked that. His mom, or dad, I don't know which, picked Fidel, right? It could have easily been different, right? They could have picked a different name, could have had different conditions. The point is like, these things are all conceptual, actually, right? But the fundamental, on a more fundamental level, this is not yet getting to like emptiness, right? But it's saying on a fundamental level, in terms of wanting happiness, not wanting suffering, being deprived of the happiness we want, and being controlled by delusions and afflictive emotions and confusion, actually there's no difference, right? And on those levels, there's no difference. Right? Any differences are just like conditioned labeling, which is not saying they don't exist at all, but they exist on a pretty superficial level. Okay, so those are 9 contemplations. And the idea would be if you actually contemplate those, one is you would come to that kind of recognition experientially, and then the other is, right, actually if you have those recognitions, one is you couldn't any longer actually be violent to others, right? You couldn't treat others meanly if you had those recognitions. You couldn't abuse others if you had those. But also you couldn't live if you really contemplate those things, right, you wouldn't be able to live your life in a self-centered way, right? You would feel then, one is, you know, you would actually become a non-violent person, right? Which doesn't mean that you don't hurt others. Like, I mean, non-violent doesn't just mean not killing people, right? But it means like you would actually feel others' perspective empathically, and you would be gentle, right? And caring to them, and you would do what you could to relieve their suffering, right? Because you would recognize their suffering is no different from your suffering. And so you would have that kind of a perspective, right? You would be a highly empathic person, a very sensitive person, and also a gentle, you know, in your approach to others, in the sense of trying hard not to harm. Okay, so that's that point about that's like they call it like unique equanimity. It's unique because it's that one is only cultivated by Mahayana practitioners.
The last 3, can you just spell out what they are again, just in brief?
Sure. So one, actually, it's in here. It's in this book.
Okay.
But I'll quote it here, or I'll try to make it really clear. So one is that there are no inherent friends or enemies because or friends, enemies, or strangers, or and so on, because those things depend on causes and conditions in terms of others' behavior. Whereas behavioral causes and conditions. That's why I would define that one.
Circumstantial.
Circumstantial. That's another way to say it. The second one is that those things are dependent upon imputation or labeling, right? So it's a different, whereas it's still a kind of conditionality, but it's a more subtle kind of conditionality. Does that make sense? And then the third one, you could almost call that one like, I mean, Kent's didn't use this term, but you can almost call that one like relativity, in the sense that the analogy Kent's gave was, he said, he gave a traditional Tibetan, I gave an air flight metaphor, he gave a traditional Tibetan metaphor. So he said, actually, mostly a Tibetan would say this, right? He said, if you're on this side of the mountain and you got to walk over it, then that's the other side of the mountain. He said, after you've walked over it, now what you were previously calling other is now this side of the mountain, but the side you were on is now the other side. So in a sense, this and that, friend and enemy, and even self and other are relative in that sense, right? Relative to your position, relative to your perspective, relative to your current stance. Does that make sense? So you see, they're all similar but different. And he called all three of those, they were a set. He called those three contemplations from the ultimate perspective. Yeah, so anyway, I want to pause there. Just other questions or thoughts?
I have a question about, I think the second step was the idea that everyone is equally, frustrated and has no happiness. Isn't, like, the development of bodhicitta is the development of a kind of happiness? Or is it like a happiness without dukkha? Like, how does that work in terms of, like, is the Dalai Lama a happy person, or,
Yeah, no, it's a good question. Like, so one way of viewing it is this is like a, let's see. So I'll say it in a few different ways. Like one is that of course like there are two things. I mean, one is actually, well, maybe I'll talk about it in terms of contaminated and uncontaminated happiness, which is a true Buddhist concept. So really, is that like, to start with, is if you look at first contaminated happiness, right, which is what we ordinary people call happiness, right? Like and then there's uncontaminated happiness, which is like a happiness that comes from things like realizing emptiness, right? So that's from a Buddhist perspective, we would say that's a genuine happiness, or whereas the other is kind of a actually in terms of the three types of suffering that we contemplate, ordinary happiness is actually considered a form of suffering in the sense that it's impermanent, it's not lasting. It's kind of ephemeral and so on. So the idea would be that you start off by thinking, actually, ordinary people, ordinary beings, right, almost never even have contaminated happiness, right? In other words, like that. If you look, first of all, like from a Buddhist perspective, if you look in the lower realms, then they almost never have any even moment of, like animals, for example, have very little even contaminated happiness, right? If you look at animals in the wild, especially, right, like they're always afraid and having to hide or be anxious and so on. And then even human beings rarely have even contaminated happiness. Often they're worried or stressed out or tired or upset or angry and so on. But then all those ordinary beings actually never have uncontaminated happiness. Whereas they've never yet had a moment of uncontaminated happiness, right? And so the idea would be that actually, even when you an initial bodhisattva, right, somebody who's just realized bodhicitta, I mean, they have much more. Actually, they still don't yet have uncontaminated happiness. But they have much more contaminated happiness at that point, because the idea being that because they treat others with compassion and love and kindness, they create a lot of, first of all, good relationships with others and also good karma, and so they end up with much more peaceful, positive relations with others. So they do have much more, bodhisattva at that level has much more contaminated happiness, actually. But to reach uncontaminated happiness, they actually have to understand emptiness, and sort of achieve those higher levels. They're still a bodhisattva. So like a higher bodhisattva who's achieved those levels, then they also start achieving uncontaminated happiness. And so the idea here would be this, actually, would be that, so a bodhisattva's mental training, which is what we're working on, right, would be that to develop love and compassion for anyone who still doesn't have every kind of happiness they want. So the idea would be that actually they don't develop compassion for Buddhas, right? So they don't develop compassion for somebody who already has every happiness. Because there's no, in other words, because compassion is wishing to free someone from suffering. So for example, if somebody doesn't have any suffering anymore, then in a sense, by definition, one doesn't develop, it's not possible to develop compassion for them because they don't suffer.
So do you think as a person develops greater realization, they have less attachment to the Buddha as an object or something like that?
So I guess the idea at that level would be like, so at that point, in a way, I mean, because like, what they say is that bodhisattva, like high bodhisattvas, for example, right, that they would view the Buddha, actually, I mean, in the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, the Buddha says, a quote, he says, "Those who by my form did see me, saw me not. The Buddhas are the truth body." Right? So actually, a high bodhisattva who's seen emptiness, or they know that almost like the form of a Buddha is a kind of teaching manifestation, but that the essence of what a Buddha is the mind that understands the ultimate nature of reality. And so in that sense, which is in a state of blissful freedom, let's call it. Yeah, so from that point of view, somebody who's actually had that experience of they almost say when somebody's seen emptiness, they've seen the truth body of a Buddha. They've experienced that. And so from their point of view, yeah, Buddha's, when they think what's a Buddha, they actually think it's great bliss realizing emptiness, for example, right? So then they wouldn't develop compassion for that because that's not, that's liberation actually, that's freedom, that's joy and bliss. So does that answer the question or not fully?
I think so. On a certain level, like does our compassion for a person become kind of maybe a crutch or something? Like if we're like the mother love is a kind of uncontaminated bodhicitta, but that is depending on something that is impermanent. That your child is impermanent and you are impermanent. You can't have that love for it forever. So there's a kind of contamination within that.
Yeah.
I don't know. I guess there's some type of tricky thing where we have love for a person or all persons, and but we're putting our love into something that is impermanent. There's a paradox there, I feel like.
Yeah, and the idea in a way, like from so if you think of generating bodhicitta, right? Actually, so somebody when you generate bodhicitta, right, like there is well, actually, in a way, you recognize certainly others' impermanence, and that's even one of the contemplations, right? And that the mortality one implies a more general understanding of impermanence. And then the idea would be actually there, though, is that as a bodhisattva more deeply understands change and impermanence, would be, that they understand, since compassion is the wish to liberate others from suffering, it's actually this idea then that the bodhisattva understands that others' suffering comes about due to causes and conditions, right, which is one of the Four Noble Truths, right, the truth of suffering, the truth of the cause of suffering. So they understand, wow, all those things are impermanent. And then that actually gives them more courage, and actually understanding others' impermanence gives them more courage in their compassion, because they recognize others are impermanent, and therefore their suffering can change. And if I help others create the right causes and the right conditions, they can become Buddhas, they can become bodhisattvas, they can become liberated, they can become all different things. And so actually the more deeply one understands impermanence, the more brave in a sense and strong one's compassion becomes, because in a way, ordinarily we sort of partly understand impermanence, but we don't really, we tend to view things as more permanent than they are, right? And to that extent, sometimes for some people like that, who haven't yet understood impermanence that deeply, compassion can almost feel like overwhelming, or hopeless, or too scary almost. Like, how can I, like people say that, how can I have compassion when I look at how much suffering there is, and how hopeless it is, and how difficult, and so on. I mean, people say that often. And the idea, in a way, is that the more one understands impermanence, the more one sort of has this recognition of, I'm already infinitely interconnected with others. right? I have been since that's our very nature is interdependent and interconnected. We've been interconnected and beginninglessly. We will be interconnected endlessly. And the idea then is that, and if that interconnectedness is in a context of utter impermanence, where things don't exist for more than or they don't exist for a second moment even, right? Everything is changing moment to moment, our bodies, our minds, that therefore compassion can work, because in any moment, like in relation to others, I can actually help somebody to become a little more free. And then over time, more and more free until they become liberated. So in a way that, like, the deeper a bodhisattva's recognition is, like that's why even like bodhisattvas can, eventually they make these vows to like create, what's it to say? Like to, relationally with others create, in relationship to others to create whole like Buddha fields, they call them, right? It's this idea that because things are impermanent, I can, what's the word? And I'm related to others, I can sort of create circumstances for others' education of their hearts, in a way, and lead them to enlightenment, right? I can create, relations where we'll be related in all different ways that are sort of liberating for others. Does that make sense? And in a way, that's what bodhisattvas do, is they sort of work within the context of impermanence to lead others towards liberation or enlightenment. So I think, and in a way, like the more deep their understanding is, the more almost it becomes easier to do that, because they can sort of recognize, and then even if others are treating them badly or doing something, like they're trying to help others and others are doing something terrible, they sort of recognize, well, that's temporary. If I don't give up on them, eventually they'll come around. I may have to, there are stories of the Buddha like that, where somebody would sort of, in lifetime after lifetime, would, even eat the Buddha, right? And he said, oh, great, I'll help the next, we're getting more related. I'm dying, they're eating me while I'm feeling compassion for them. For sure, later I'll be able to guide them to enlightenment, They would say, eat me 5 or 6 times, no problem, then I'll lead you to enlightenment or something. There's this idea of like that impermanence is part of what allows bodhisattvas to use interdependent circumstances to help others. I don't know, does that sort of...
I think that helps.
Yeah, other comments or questions? So do people want, usually we do like an interactive time, so there's just time for that. So here's what I want to suggest is, to break up into groups of let's say 3, and just to talk about this idea of equalizing self with others, using any of those points we talked about. And what I want to ask you to do particularly, though, is to talk, because I think if you're honest with yourself and you start to think about those things, what you should feel, not should in the sense of it, because it's good to feel, but should feel in the sense of, I would predict, is resistance to that, right? Is, well, no, I don't want to equalize myself with others. I need to take care of myself, right? That's our, what's our called? Take care of number 1, right? Like we have a culture like that. And it's not just our culture, actually all human cultures have that to some extent in them, except bodhisattva cultures, right? So what I want to suggest is just to bring them to groups and to talk about your own resistances, okay? So to say, what ways you either want to hold on to the idea of enemy, no, it's important, it's important. You may have something that comes up that says, no, I need to hold on to my recognition of those enemies as real, because I want to protect myself from them. Or, no, I want to hold on to my sense of taking care of myself first, because I think that's important in some way. But just to talk about your inner resistance to those trainings, okay? And just to give each other feedback, that's all. Just to sort of share resistances or hesitations, and then just give each other feedback about that. Does that make sense? Okay, so bring them into groups of 3 and just share those kind of thoughts, and then we'll come back together at the very end for a few minutes. So any comments or questions from the small group discussions? Anything you guys? Any amazing insights you want to share? Be great. But no. Okay. Well, maybe I'll just say a couple comments and then we'll stop. So I just think, I want to say, I think it's good to recognize one's own resistances, otherwise, the reason why I say, I don't know, Tibetans, I don't think you could use the word resistance exactly, I guess that's more of a psychological Western term, but I think it's fair, the idea, right, is that, we've been familiar with self-centeredness, self-cherishing, actually from a Buddhist perspective, since beginningless time, right? That's the idea, right? In other words, so in countless previous lives, you've been familiar with not being equal, even-minded, and with being self-centered and so on. And so, I guess from a Buddhist perspective, the term they would use is habituate, like that you're very habituated to that. And so it's only natural. In other words, the point I wanted to make with that exercise is, if you pretend to yourself, oh, I have no resistance and it's all, I'm 100% on board with that, well then, that's silly in a way, right? Because, you've been familiar with the other way since beginningless time, and it's not easy, right, to change these things. It's possible, one can do it, but it's not like the easiest thing, and there are habits, old habits, right? And I'll just share for a minute, even though we went over just slightly, I'm not going to go too long, but there's a very funny text by the first Panchen Lama, I mentioned it at the retreat a little bit, but called a debate between, in his case it was about emptiness actually, so he said a debate between self-grasping ignorance, the mind of self-grasping ignorance and wisdom understanding selflessness. It's a very funny thing, but there's this whole inner dialogue that I really like, where his self-centered mind, right, says things like, well, I've got to take care of myself, and nobody, nobody appreciates wisdom anyway. The world really prefers ignorance. Everybody's ignorant. Also, if I send out if I send out my warriors of greed and envy, and then everybody will totally forget about you, and then and then wisdom has to debate, right, and say things like, well, actually nobody does like you, because in other words, because you totally isolate yourself from others, and I understand my interdependence with others, right, and so on. Anyway, it's a funny text, but the point there is that we have to do something like that with ourselves, right? We have to recognize our own self-centered habits and listen to them in order to debate with them, and sort of overcome them. And that's what these 9 contemplations are. I just want to say that they're not formulaic, whereas if you're really meditating on these, if you just say, it's not like a mantra that you just go, everybody's happy, everybody's equal and wanting to be happy, everybody's equal and wanting to be happy, everybody. It's not like that. It's more like you recognize your own experience of what's there to say it, you think of when somebody cut in front of you, on the road, and you bring up that feeling of of the thought of what an idiot, right? And then you recognize, then so it's more experiential like that. You bring up your own self-centeredness that thinks that way, right? And then you say, you kind of hold on to that in a way, and you say, okay, what do you mean by there, idiot, right? That means I'm the most important. You start to recognize your own, you debate with yourself. You recognize, wow, when I have that thought that's habitual to thinking somebody else is an idiot, right? Anybody else is an idiot, right? That means I'm totally caught in my own self-centered perspective, right? I totally am not caring about others. I'm not recognizing that we're all the same, right? I'm not recognizing that I do that and that other people look at me and think I'm an idiot. I'm not recognizing that that person has their own wanting to be happy, right? They're desperate to get somewhere. I'm not recognizing that they have their own deprived of happiness, right? They're totally wanting something, right? They're in a hurry because they want to get somewhere, because they want something, right? That they're caught in their own afflictive emotions, just like I am, and we're the same in that way, right? And then until you keep habituating yourself, right? Until the feeling that arises is when you think of them cutting in front of you, instead of thinking, oh, what's wrong with them, right? You actually give rise to the feeling wow, they're so wonderful, right? I love them, And when you give rise to that feeling, then you've won that debate, right? You see what I'm getting at? So this is not something formulaic. It should be something experiential, right? And so every time, whereas that's what you meditate on, in a way. So when you sit down in the morning to meditate, what you think about is well, yesterday, when so-and-so said this to me, and I thought, whatever, and I thought, oh, they're being so selfish. How could they say that? I don't know, this person, oh, they were so selfish. Why did they say that? Right? And then you contemplate to yourself, wow, when I'm doing that, wow, I'm having this really extreme perspective of I'm over here and they're over there and they're like that and I'm like this. And selfish means that they're not doing what I want, which means that I'm selfish. And so you really realize wow, so I'm being selfish. Oh, that's interesting. And you keep debating with yourself until you come to a point of where you transcend that, right? And then again, you've that's a good meditation. And if you keep doing that over and over again, then eventually there'll come a point where, somebody does something, and in the moment, right, you've habituated yourself to these other new thoughts, new ways of seeing things, and then the moment somebody does that, and you start to have your old thought, and then you debate it in the moment, right? And you're able to kind of overcome it. And then eventually there comes a point after years, right, where maybe somebody does that, you immediately think, oh, how wonderful, they're beautiful, you know, like I really appreciate them. But that only comes through habituation and training, right? And if you don't train, then, you know, then you'll say, well, I heard that teaching on Mahayana, something, Bodhichitta, but it doesn't really work, you know. But it's because if you don't habituate yourself to it, then, whereas like, you know, it's like, it would be like what? It'd be like if you buy noodles and you leave them in your cabinet and then you say, I never got, you know, they didn't give me any nutrition, right? Well, they don't give you nutrition unless you eat them, right? You have to cook them and then eat them, right? And the cooking in this case is actually relating it to your own experience, right? And really, like, until you finally come to an inner transformation over and over again. And that's how you give nutrition to your mind until eventually you'll realize these points. So, okay, that's that. And then last thing I'll say is that, so we, you know, Gabe sent out an email. But so next week, it's next week, right? We canceled class because too many people had to travel and so on. So next week there's no class, but in 2 weeks there's class. So we'll continue on. We're going to talk about more about this equalizing and exchanging self for others, some of the techniques from that. So the faults of self-cherishing, the advantages of cherishing others, how to exchange self for others, and a little bit on taking and giving meditation, totally. And then the week after that, we're doing, we have a continued class, but it won't be here because we're going to do it in a park, because we're going to do the animal liberation. So it's like a special, that's part of this Bodhichitta module where you do special practices for animals. And then we'll have 2 more days of class where we'll go over the rest of the method. It'll be a little bit retreat, so we'll meditate more, but we're still gonna, I'm just gonna keep going, so we'll do a lot of taking and giving meditation, especially in those retreat days, so people can really learn more details about there are all different ways to do taking and giving, different visualizations and different contemplations. So in the retreat days, we'll like kind of do all the meditations over again. We'll also do a whole bunch of more on taking and giving, and on how to give rise to the actual bodhicitta. So that's the plan for this.
What is animal liberation? What is that?
Well, that is, I'll go over it more on the 10th, but it's a practice, actually, if you've ever seen, Tibetans are huge on this, like there's a huge cultural history of, like, so the main practice is that you find animals that are about to be killed, right, and then you purchase them, right, and you do prayers for them and like mantras and carry them around stupas, you do different practices to benefit them, and then you set them free. And if you see, like, Tibetans will do that with like yaks that are going to be killed, or what do you call it, like sheep, you know. So if anybody has a place to keep a yak or a sheep, we can do that. You know, otherwise we'll do in the West. You know, in other words, in a context like this, we'll often do crickets that are about to, you know, that you buy to feed to snakes and lizards, or like worms that are going to be used for fishing. And the idea is you just like you buy them, right, and then we do like these certain practices to create good karma in relation to them, and then set them free someplace that's safe for them. And so it's just a practice. It's a way of, like, since we're doing bodhicitta, it's an actual practice of practicing trying to give rise to compassion to beings that we ordinarily don't notice, right? There's often times people don't notice a worm, right? So the idea is that it's just an actual practical practice to sort of, let's say, in relation to a cricket, and people can also bring their pets since we're doing the practice. But the idea is like, it's just a training in actually practicing compassion in sort of towards those who we ordinarily don't pay attention to. I guess in Tibetan culture also, and well, in Buddhism they say also that it's often done, one is it's done as a practice of compassion, another is that it's done as a way of sort of creating a karmic link to beings, so that you kind of say, so now when I become a Buddha, may they be my students in a way. So we're starting that process now, you know. And the one last thing is that they also say that it's a cause of, saving others from death is one of the karmic causes of long life. So oftentimes, if you participate, then you're creating a cause for your own long life. And also usually, like nowadays, we've been dedicating it for Lama Zopa's long life too. So sort of liberating them and also dedicating the merit for them. So that's the idea in general. I'll say a little more about it next week. But for now, let's, since we went over, let's just dedicate any virtuous karma, any positive merit that we created. And let's particularly, dedicate that so that all of us here can realize equalizing and then exchanging of, like, so equalizing self with other, overcoming self-centeredness, and generating a mind that cherishes and loves others, and compassion, bodhicitta. And then may all beings everywhere, every being infinite throughout infinite space, may they also realize equanimity, the faults of self-centeredness, the advantages of cherishing others. May they all realize love and compassion and bodhicitta. Through this merit, like, may I be able to help all beings to realize that, and lead all of them to enlightenment as quickly as possible.